Thank you very much to Bill and the organisers for asking me and giving me the opportunity to present here. Shortly before getting ready to come to the conference, I emailed Bill to ask him what he wanted from my talk and how he thought that my presentation fitted into the overall themes of the symposium. And Bill emailed back with 3 things that he thought he'd like to see addressed in this talk. So the way I'm going to structure things is I'm going to give begin with some background material and a bit of perspective, and then I'm going to focus the bulk of the talk on addressing these 3 issues that Bill highlighted relating to how we think about uncertainty and how we incorporate it into decision making. I should begin by explaining my perspective because I'm not a conservation biologist. I'm somewhat of the reverse, if anything. I tend to concentrate on getting rid of stuff rather than getting it there. So I'm an applied ecologist with an interest in weed population dynamics. So we study populations like the blackgrass I've got a picture of up here. What we do is to go out into the field, monitor populations, talk to farmers about what methods they're using to control the weeds, what methods aren't working, look at management histories, put all this data together and combining it into different types of models of varying levels of complexity. We look at what happens to the models as we change different types of management and make predictions on a variety of timescales from what happens to the weeds next year to what happens as we change management in terms of evolutionary outcomes, herbicide resistance, even some impacts on things like biodiversity, and then go back to land managers and farmers and see what they think. So that's my perspective on my background. This talks about uncertainty. So what is uncertainty? Well, uncertainty is pervasive, and it's variability in outcomes resulting from unknown or partially known processes, parameters, data, or effects of intervention. It's absolutely pervasive in ecology, and it's particularly important in the kind of work I do, which is modelling focused and centres on making quantitative predictions. And this talk's really going to focus on applications of uncertainty in models and statistics, but I do take the point that Hugh Possingham made yesterday, that models can actually take a variety of forms and types. As I said, uncertainty is pervasive because ecological systems are enormously variable at just about every scale at which you measure them. So individuals are variable, populations are variable, different communities are variable, years are variable, sites are variable. Everything we know about ecology is that they are extremely variable, and they're variable for all sorts of reasons. And this generates an uncertainty, variability, which is pervasive throughout ecology. When we start to think about what uncertainty is and how uncertainty, variability feed into modelling, feed into decision making, it's important to start to think about what are the sources of uncertainty and how do they influence predictions that we might make. Now, lots of people have thought about this. I've highlighted some reviews down at the bottom from the conservation and applied ecology literature, and there are lots and lots of ways of thinking about uncertainty. What I'm going to do is take a relatively simplistic approach in thinking about uncertainty and how it feeds into models. So I put a cartoon up here. I realise that it's horribly linear. That realistically, processes of model development, implementation, and management are iterative, complicated, and much more complicated than shown here. The reason for taking such a simple method is just to really highlight the key types of uncertainty that feed into the kind of models that we work with. So we start with data, we collect data, we use those data to generate models, we generate some output, and the dashed line there represents where we start to move from science to practice, taking our model output and thinking about how we can use it. We implement and we make some kind of action. Now, all the bits in green I've shown are the bits where we might get uncertainty entering the system and being important in our predictions. So the data we generate have process uncertainty. That's the actual processes that generate year-to-year variability or site-to-site variability. But when we measure the system, we generate additional error. We do statistical analysis. We don't end up with point estimates. We end up with parameters plus variances. We feed into not just one model, but typically lots of models, either formally or informally. We generate output, which collects up all that uncertainty, and then have an implementation, which also itself has uncertainty. We can't be sure that when we implement the decision we make or the outputs we recommend, that will actually be without uncertainty. Uncertainty has been pervasive in the work that I've done and been really influential in shaping the way that we've worked. And the reason is that uncertainty can enter the kind of models that I've been dealing with at all of those different levels. And here's a simple example of why uncertainty is so important. So we work on arable weeds like blackgrass here, and arable weeds produce seeds. They live for a year, and at the end of the year, plants that have grown produce more seeds, and the population turns over. Now, a weed plant might produce 100 seeds. And if our model is going to generate an equilibrium, then on average, 99% of those seeds must die and 1% survive in order to generate a stable equilibrium population. It's simple population dynamics. But if that mortality were 0.98, 98%, then instead of one plant leading to one survivor next year, one plant would lead to 2 survivors next year, and the population would double from one year to the next. On the other hand, if the mortality were 100%, the population would go extinct. So we can go from a prediction of doubling of the population stability to extinction for very small variations in our parameters. And what's really important is understanding where this variation is coming from. So it could be that this is process variation. This is actually a property of the weed populations themselves. They live close to extinction boundaries. That makes them extremely stochastic. That's important because we've got to capture that somehow. It could be that our data are just rubbish, so our mortalities are estimated with so much error we can't make a useful prediction. That's important because we have to think about what to do next. Or it could be that the models we're using are bad. We're ignoring some kind of stabilizing mechanism that prevents this kind of boom and bust population dynamics. For instance, some kind of density dependence that we've not yet measured. And all three of these are actually in possibilities. And it's, thinking about what drives uncertainty has been fundamental in the work that we've done here. So I want to start by thinking about the questions that Bill threw at me. So the first thing was actually a comment that the problem with scientists is that they keep adding uncertainty and it depends when practitioners just want to know an answer. Reading around, I think there's a neat paper by Bradshaw and Borchers from back in 2000 who highlighted the contrast between scientists and practitioners in the way that we approach problems and the way that we express ourselves. So particularly scientists are very concerned about probabilities. They're very expressing statistical probabilities, probabilities of outcomes. And because probabilities are always conditional on something, they're always keen on qualifying their conclusions. Whereas practitioners require a focus on outcomes and a focus on certainties. So the scientist might tell you the probability it will work. The practitioner may want to know whether it will work. The kind of way we approach problems can be different. And particularly at the bottom, I want to emphasize that scientists are really, really keen on replication because we want to be able to generalize. We want to be able to say that this doesn't just work here, it works on average across lots of different situations. Whereas practice is very often situational. Someone managing a population in a particular place needs to know that that management will actually work. To give an example of the way the scientific approach can play out and leads to ambiguity is I'm going to just run through a kind of a toy example of implementing scientific predictions from very good actual science. And this is kind of perhaps a kind of an uncertainty that people have called linguistic uncertainty in the conservation literature. So the most common way that we implement scientific recommendations in day-to-day life is by listening to a weather forecast. And a weather forecast might tell you that there's a 50% chance that it's going to rain today. So that seems like a good scientific prediction. From a scientific perspective, it's very, very nice. Now, interpreting that is actually much harder than it might seem. So a 50% chance of rain means that one set of models or one value of the parameter in the model tells you it's going to rain. Another set of models, or just tweaking the parameters a bit, tells you it's not going to rain, it's going to be sunny. I mean, that's one outcome. It could be that a 50% chance of rain means it's going to rain in some parts of the area, not in others. Or a 50% chance of rain could mean it's going to rain half the day and it's not going to rain the other half. So, and it could be, in fact, a 50% chance of rain is predicted by the models, because the models are so bad they can't make any sensible prediction, and all they did was toss a coin. So a 50% chance of rain is actually compatible with four rather contrasting outputs here. And even though intuitively the statement makes sense, actually using it in an implementation might be harder than we think. So given this kind of uncertainty and thinking about these sources of uncertainty, the next question is, well, what are the ways that we can incorporate this and accommodate this as we think about making predictions about management? And I think, as I've just mentioned, I think that translating from science to practice and thinking about how we accommodate uncertainty, I think the focus in these differences between science perspectives and practitioner perspectives really boil down to thinking about the focus of science on probabilities and qualified conclusions, whereas practitioners really focus on outcomes and certainties, and the different perspectives between replication and situational outcomes. There's some really nice work coming through that's starting to address this. And what we need is that methods that integrate probabilities of outcome with the associated risks and chances of success. So thinking not just about what's the probability of the outcome that we're predicting from the model, but how does it then link to the risks of making a wrong decision balanced against the probability of different outcomes. Scientists are really good, actually, at integrating uncertainty into the modelling part of the process. We're very good at integrating uncertainty into building our models. Then the stage of going from making outputs and linking to practice is where I think the really interesting stuff is. Here's a paper that I just picked up in the last few days, which is in Conservation Letters, which is taking a novel approach called stochastic dominance. And this builds in a whole range of different factors, not just the probability of an outcome, but also the risks, attitudes to risk, and risk aversion, which then it can be used to rank different options in terms of how preferable they are. So the third question is, well, how should practitioners deal with uncertainty in making decisions? So if we've got some uncertainty, we can incorporate it into our predictions. What's the consequence for practitioners? How can we start to use this in a useful sense? And the answer to this question, I think, boils down to three different aspects. So as I just outlined, there's the cost and the risk of making the wrong decision and the consequences that this would have. So the method I just outlined, and I'm going to look at it again in a minute, is balancing the costs versus risks alongside the evidence that we can provide us from our models. It's also important to understand, well, does the uncertainty that the scientists are giving us lead to biases that will be important in some sense? So does uncertainty just add noise, or does it systematically lead you to make the wrong decision? And then the final thing is, well, we're giving some output from a model. There's lots of uncertainty. Is what we need more information on the basis of which to make a better decision? So in the toy example that I put up, it's easy to see how costs and risks might feed into making a decision, even if you've got relatively uncertain predictions. So here, if the biggest decision we've got to make is whether to take an umbrella or not with us, then the cost is relatively slight. You just put an umbrella in your bag. The risk is that you get soaked, and the action is relatively straightforward. You'd almost certainly take an umbrella, irrespective of what you thought the outcome might be. So the uncertainty in the prediction here isn't so much of a problem. I mean, in fact, even if the probability of rain was only 10%, you might take an umbrella anyway because the cost is so low relative to the risk. But if you're a farmer or a land manager trying to interpret this information, it might be a bit different. So if you're farming and you want to do something like go out and spray something, or you want to go out and harvest your crop, you definitely don't really want to be doing it when it's raining, because there are costs. It's expensive to apply chemicals. It's expensive to go out driving a tractor and pay someone to do it. If you're harvesting and it's raining, then your crop potentially is ruined, or at least the quality is degraded. So in this situation, you want to be considerably more risk averse in terms of your interpreting the evidence and deciding what you did. So second thing is, does uncertainty cause bias? So if we express uncertainty in what we're doing and acknowledge that it's there, does it cause bias in the decisions that we make? I mean, sometimes it will, and sometimes it won't. If we're just adding noise in an unstructured way, we're probably not going to cause bias. We're just making worse predictions. But sometimes we'll add bias through uncertainty. So here's an example from a conservation example, thinking about how we do threat assessments for endangered animals. So as people here probably know much better than I do, the IUCN produces indices of threat which aimed at understanding whether species are under threatened and how threatened they are, using the best evidence that's available. And a 5-point scale is used, going from very little concern about their threat status to critically endangered and even extinct in the wild. And there's a formal process for doing this. It's rigorous and has got very clear criteria. Now, the problem is that if there's not enough information available to do the assessment, you can't make a threat status assessment, and species are deemed to be data deficient. And for lots of groups, particularly big groups, there are potentially very many of these species. So these species are just simply ignored in the analysis and given a data deficient status. Now, in a paper published last year with Walter Yates, we looked at this with a modelling approach. And what we did was to take the assessed species and create statistical models that included some geographic information, life history information, phylogenetic and spatial information, and produced models that predicted whether species were likely to be, fitted models that explained whether species that were assessed were under threat and how much threat. So we built models fitted to the assessed species, and we then applied them to predict the threat status of data deficient species, the species which hadn't been assessed. And when we did this, we found that the assessed species and data deficient species had almost completely polar opposite distributions of threat likelihood. So assessed species were kind of shifted towards low threats, data deficient species were shifted towards high threats. And the reason for this is that the variables that make species likely to be threatened are having a small range size, not being very abundant, and living in remote parts of the world that are under lots of threat from environmental change. These make species very likely to be data deficient at the same time because they don't have enough information then to be able to make a firm assessment. So in this example, if we ignore uncertainty through simply ignoring data deficiency, we come to the conclusion that the group is less threatened than it actually is. The final thing to talk about is the question of, is more information needed to make a better decision? I don't have to say a lot about this because Hugh Possingham covered it last night, generating some slightly sweaty rewriting of the talk from my perspective. The paper that he highlighted in the Best Methods Journal in Ecology and Evolution is a really nice example of how we can start to make this assessment of value of information. Asking the question or two questions really, do we actually have enough information to make a good decision even if the information's uncertain? And then would adding more information then enable us to make a better decision, and and can we put that into a cost framework? So, just running out of time, conclusions from the talk are, well, uncertainty, variability is pervasive, and everything we know about ecology would lead us to expect that. It's really important to understand the sources of uncertainty and how they feed into models and outcomes. I didn't talk about implementation uncertainty, but that's potentially important in these very applied contexts where we do something and then need to follow up on actually whether what we did had an effect or not. And thinking, does uncertainty compromise decisions that we make? It's an important question to ask. Is the evidence that we have good enough or do we need to collect more data, and doing that in a rigorous way. And also, the final thing I've emphasised is that we have to think carefully about the workflows when we're creating models. So the classic linear cartoon that I put up at the start is prone to problems because we create models that are computationally and mathematically convenient without thinking at the outset about how we are going to use those and deploy those for real problems. So really building in outcomes and how we expect to use the models right at the design stage is incredibly important. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rob. Yes. Yes.
Rob, thanks for a great talk. I wondered if, well, maybe I have two questions. One is, to what extent do you think we should be trained more in uncertainty, specifically as well as statistics from an early age? And the other one was about, in your experience of talking to practitioners, I think that depending on people's character, either they trust you more when you talk about uncertainty, or they just get confused. They just turn off and say that you say I'm uncertain, and they hear there is no answer.
I think the training element is really important because we have to understand that if we're doing applied modelling, then at some point what we're going to do is going to be used, and we have to then have understand how we can build models that are going to be robust in the face of all the sources of uncertainty that we'd expect. In terms of taking models out and using them, I mean, in the kind of communities in which we've been talking, the real challenge is that I can't go to a farmer and say, look, to control this weed, you need a 97.6% mortality when you spray the herbicides. The farmer really wants to know, how many times do I have to spray? But we can actually provide good information then on saying, well, if you do spray, then we recommend that you follow up and collect some data yourself. You do field walking and actually monitor the effectiveness of the intervention. And if after 3 weeks, the density is this when it was originally this, that's probably a bad thing. So I think that's actually a training element as well in thinking about how we get managers to interpret what they're told and then incorporate uncertainty into the way they respond as well.
Thank you. Yes, Andy.
Thanks very much. You use the word uncertainty to describe situations in which there is confidence in some kind of distribution function. So what do you call a situation, and what do we do about it, where there isn't such confidence?
So you mean I think that really gets at the more technical end when we put together models. Maybe I don't know 10, 15 years ago we'd have the model, which would be we'd have a distribution function for a variable. We'd have functions for the density dependence, all the different bits and bobs, and we'd refine the model and select amongst all the different models that we could have put together, exclude some bits, bring other things in we think are interesting, and then present that as the model. Now I think taking a lead, say from the climate modelling, it's much more routine to consider several models simultaneously or to integrate across uncertainties. So in a case of a distribution function, you might choose several, or you might choose a generalized form and then integrate across the uncertainty in that. And that's actually the bit I think ecologists and scientists are actually quite good at doing and quite motivated to do, because the computational technology has come on and it's kind of fun to do. I think it's actually then taking that into the next stage, which is where the really interesting cutting edge is.
Okay, I'm afraid I am going to have to move this on, so can we thank Rob once again for a really fantastic talk.